The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez adjusted her gear one final time. She had learned long ago that blending in was more than just survival, it was an art form. Her small frame and quiet demeanor had always worked to her advantage, allowing people to underestimate her before they realized who they were dealing with. Today would be no different. Sarah had been deployed to this forward operating base in Afghanistan for what was supposed to be a routine intelligence gathering mission. Her SEAL team designation was classified, known only to a select few commanding officers. To everyone else on base, she appeared to be just another support personnel, perhaps a communications specialist or logistics coordinator. It was exactly how she preferred it. The base buzzed with morning activity as soldiers prepared for their daily routines. Sarah made her way toward the mess hall, her eyes automatically scanning for potential threats and exit routes, habits that had been drilled into her through years of elite training. The smell of coffee and breakfast rations filled the air, mixing with the ever-present dust that seemed to coat everything in this part of the world. She had barely settled into a corner table with her meal tray when she noticed him. Sergeant Marcus Thompson was impossible to miss, even in a crowd. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to strain against his uniform, he commanded attention wherever he went. His voice carried across the mess hall as he regaled a group of younger soldiers with stories of his supposed combat heroics. "I'm telling you, when the Taliban fighters saw me coming, they scattered like roaches when you turn on the lights," Thompson boasted, his chest puffed out with pride. "These hands have taken down more enemies than most of you will see in your entire careers." Sarah kept her expression neutral as she ate, but she couldn't help noticing the way Thompson's audience hung on his every word. Some looked genuinely impressed, others seemed skeptical but too intimidated to voice their doubts. She had encountered men like Thompson before, bullies who used their size and position to compensate for insecurities they refused to acknowledge. What caught her attention more than his bragging was the way he treated the support staff. When a young private accidentally bumped into him while carrying a tray, Thompson's demeanor shifted instantly from jovial storyteller to menacing predator. "Watch where you're going, you worthless piece of garbage," Thompson snarled, grabbing the private by the collar. "Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time paying attention, you wouldn't be such a walking disaster." The young soldier stammered an apology, his face flushing red with embarrassment and fear. Sarah could see his hands trembling as he tried to clean up the spilled food from his tray. The mess hall had grown quieter, with many soldiers pretending not to notice the confrontation while others watched with obvious discomfort. Thompson wasn't finished. He seemed to feed off the attention, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "You know what your problem is? You're soft. This military has gone soft, letting weaklings like you waste our time and resources. In my day, they would have washed you out before you even made it through basic training." Sarah set down her fork, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. She had seen enough bullies in her life to recognize the pattern. Thompson was establishing dominance, marking his territory like some kind of animal. The fact that he was picking on someone who couldn't defend himself made it even more pathetic. "Maybe you need some extra training to toughen you up," Thompson continued, his grip still tight on the private's collar. "Report to the motor pool after chow. You can spend the rest of the morning cleaning every vehicle until they shine. And if I find so much as a speck of dust, you'll be doing it again tomorrow." The private nodded quickly, clearly eager to escape the confrontation. As Thompson finally released him, Sarah watched the young man hurry away, his shoulders hunched with shame. The normal buzz of conversation gradually returned to the mess hall, but she could feel the lingering tension in the air. Thompson returned to his table as if nothing had happened, immediately launching back into another story about his supposed battlefield accomplishments. His friends laughed at all the right moments, but Sarah could see the forced nature of their responses. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Thompson had clearly cultivated an atmosphere where challenging him was not an option. Sarah finished her breakfast in silence, her mind automatically cataloging everything she had observed. Thompson's body language suggested someone who had probably seen some combat, but his stories had the rehearsed quality of someone who had embellished the truth beyond recognition. More concerning was his obvious pattern of targeting those he perceived as weak or vulnerable. As she prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning. Men like Thompson rarely limited themselves to verbal intimidation, especially when they thought no one was watching or willing to stop them. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her that Sergeant Marcus Thompson was going to be a problem. The rest of her morning was spent in meetings with intelligence officers, reviewing satellite imagery and communication intercepts. Her official cover story held up perfectly. She asked the right questions, took detailed notes, and generally played the part of a competent but unremarkable support officer. None of her colleagues suspected that she could navigate hostile terrain in complete darkness, eliminate targets with surgical precision, or survive for weeks behind enemy lines with minimal supplies. It was during lunch that she encountered Thompson again. This time, his target was a female supply clerk who had apparently made some minor error in processing his equipment request. Sarah watched from across the courtyard as Thompson towered over the much smaller woman, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "Are you telling me that you can't do your job properly?" Thompson demanded, stepping closer to the clerk until she was forced to back against a supply crate. "Maybe the problem is that we're letting people who don't belong here make important decisions." The supply clerk, a corporal with barely 2 years of service, tried to explain the bureaucratic delay, but Thompson cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I don't want to hear excuses. I want results. And if you can't deliver results, maybe you need to find a different line of work." Sarah could see the woman's distress from across the courtyard. Her hands were shaking as she shuffled through paperwork, clearly trying to find some way to resolve the situation without further angering Thompson. Several other soldiers had noticed the confrontation, but, like in the mess hall, they seemed reluctant to intervene. Thompson leaned in closer, lowering his voice but not enough that Sarah couldn't hear his words. "You know, mistakes like this can really hurt someone's career. Lucky for you, I'm in a generous mood today. Maybe we can work something out. You help me, and I'll help you." The implication in his tone was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her muscles tense involuntarily. This had moved beyond simple bullying into something much darker. The supply clerk seemed to understand the subtext as well, her eyes darting around desperately as if looking for an escape route. "I'll check with my supervisor," the woman stammered, clearly trying to buy time. "There might be another way to expedite your request." Thompson's smile was predatory. "That's what I like to hear. Initiative. Maybe you're not as hopeless as I thought." He stepped back slightly but remained close enough to maintain his intimidating presence. "I'll check back with you this evening. Make sure you have good news for me." As Thompson finally walked away, Sarah made her decision. She had been trained to remain invisible, to avoid drawing attention to herself or her capabilities. But she had also been trained to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes those two imperatives came into conflict, and, when they did, her moral compass always pointed in the same direction. She approached the supply clerk, who was still leaning against the crate with obvious relief that the confrontation was over. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked softly, her voice carrying genuine concern. The woman looked up, startled by the unexpected kindness. "Oh, yes, I'm fine. Just a misunderstanding about some equipment requests." Her attempt at a reassuring smile was unconvincing. "That didn't look like a misunderstanding," Sarah said carefully. "If someone is making you uncomfortable, there are procedures." "No, really, it's fine," the clerk interrupted quickly, glancing around nervously. "Sergeant Thompson is just intense about his job. He wants things done right, that's all." Sarah recognized the fear in the woman's voice. She had heard it before from other victims of workplace harassment and abuse. The reluctance to report, the tendency to minimize the behavior, the desperate hope that it would simply go away if ignored. Unfortunately, men like Thompson rarely stopped on their own. "My name is Sarah," she offered, extending her hand. "If you ever need someone to talk to, or if anything else happens, please don't hesitate to find me." The supply clerk shook her hand gratefully. "I'm Jenny Morrison. And, thank you, but I'm sure everything will be fine. Sergeant Thompson just has high standards." Sarah nodded, understanding that pushing further would only make Jenny more uncomfortable. But, as she walked away, she made a mental note to keep a close eye on both Thompson and his potential victims. Her training had taught her patience, and she was prepared to wait and watch until the right moment presented itself. That evening, Sarah made it her business to be in the vicinity of the supply depot during Thompson's promised return visit. She positioned herself in the shadows between two storage buildings, her dark clothing and natural stealth making her virtually invisible in the gathering dusk. Thompson arrived exactly when he said he would, his swagger even more pronounced than usual. Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath from 20 feet away, which explained his increased boldness. Liquid courage was a dangerous thing in the hands of a man who was already prone to aggressive behavior. Well, Thompson called out as he approached the supply depot. "I hope you have good news for me, Morrison. I've been looking forward to this conversation all day." Jenny emerged from the depot carrying a clipboard, her entire demeanor radiating nervous energy. "I spoke with my supervisor, Sergeant. We can expedite your request, but it will take at least 3 more days to process through the proper channels." Thompson's expression darkened immediately. 3 days? That's not what I wanted to hear. He moved closer, backing Jenny against the depot door. "I think maybe you didn't understand what I was offering earlier. Sometimes things work better when people cooperate on a more personal level." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she watched Thompson reach out to touch Jenny's arm. The younger woman tried to step away, but there was nowhere to go. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, and Sarah could see her entire body trembling. "Please, Sergeant," Jenny whispered. "I'm just trying to do my job properly." "The regulations require—" "Forget the regulations," Thompson interrupted, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "What you need to understand is that I have friends in high places. I can make your life very easy, or I can make it very difficult. The choice is yours." He pressed closer, effectively trapping Jenny against the door. Sarah could see his hand moving toward Jenny's waist, and she knew she couldn't wait any longer. Sometimes the best way to handle a predator was to remind him that he wasn't always the biggest threat in the jungle. Sarah stepped out of the shadows with deliberate slowness, her movements silent but purposeful. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most effective weapon was simply appearing at the right moment. The element of surprise was worth more than any amount of physical force. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. "Is there a problem here?" Thompson spun around, clearly startled by her sudden appearance. His expression shifted from surprise to annoyance as he took in Sarah's small stature and seemingly harmless appearance. In his alcohol-influenced state, she probably looked like nothing more than another obstacle to overcome. "This is a private conversation," Thompson growled, his hand moving protectively to Jenny's shoulder as if claiming ownership. "Why don't you mind your own business and keep walking?" Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp and alert. "It didn't look very private to me. In fact, it looked like the corporal might need some assistance." Thompson laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Assistance? From you?" He looked Sarah up and down dismissively. "What are you, some kind of pencil pusher? This is military business, sweetheart. Why don't you run along before you get yourself in trouble?" The condescending tone and dismissive attitude confirmed everything Sarah had suspected about Thompson. He saw weakness where others saw strength, and he interpreted kindness as vulnerability. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten bullies in trouble for as long as there had been bullies. "I think the corporal is perfectly capable of speaking for herself," Sarah replied calmly. "Jenny, are you okay? Do you need any help?" Jenny's eyes darted between Sarah and Thompson, clearly torn between her fear of retaliation and her desire for escape. Thompson's grip on her shoulder tightened visibly, and Sarah could see his knuckles whitening with the pressure. "She's fine," Thompson answered before Jenny could speak. "In fact, we were just finishing up our business. Weren't we, Morrison?" The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Jenny nodded quickly, though her eyes pleaded silently with Sarah for understanding. It was an impossible situation. Any intervention would likely make things worse for Jenny in the long run, but walking away would leave her vulnerable to Thompson's continued harassment. Sarah made her choice. "Actually, I was looking for you, Corporal Morrison. Lieutenant Hayes needs to see you about the supply manifest for tomorrow's convoy. He said it was urgent." It was a complete fabrication, but it served its purpose. Jenny seized the opportunity immediately, slipping out from under Thompson's grip with obvious relief. "Of course, I'll go see him right away. Thank you for letting me know." Thompson's face darkened with anger as he realized his prey was escaping. "This conversation isn't over, Morrison. We still have business to discuss." "I'm sure whatever business you have can wait until normal duty hours," Sarah said smoothly, stepping slightly between Thompson and Jenny. The lieutenant was very specific about the urgency of his request. For a moment, Thompson looked like he might try to push past Sarah to reclaim his hold on Jenny. His fists clenched at his sides, and she could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options. But something in Sarah's steady gaze seemed to give him pause, perhaps some instinct warning him that she wasn't quite what she appeared to be. "Fine," Thompson said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." As Jenny hurried away toward the main building, Thompson turned his full attention to Sarah. She could see the anger and humiliation burning in his eyes, mixed with something that looked disturbingly like interest. She had prevented him from achieving his immediate goal, but, in doing so, she had also made herself a target. "You know, I don't think we've been properly introduced," Thompson said, his tone shifting to something that might have been charm if not for the underlying menace. "Sergeant Marcus Thompson. And you are?" "Lieutenant Martinez," Sarah replied evenly, not bothering to extend her hand. "I'm with the intelligence staff." Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Intelligence? Well. That explains the sneaking around in the shadows." He moved closer, apparently testing to see if she would back down. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what exactly did your intelligence training teach you about situations like this?" Sarah remained motionless, her feet planted firmly and her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. Everything about her posture suggested calm professionalism, but anyone with real combat experience would have recognized the subtle signs of someone prepared for immediate action. "It taught me to recognize threats," Sarah said quietly. "And to deal with them appropriately." Thompson laughed again, but there was less confidence in it this time. Something about Sarah's calm demeanor seemed to be getting under his skin, challenging his assumptions about control and dominance. "Threats? The only threat around here is to military discipline. We can't have people undermining the chain of command just because they don't like how things are done." "I agree completely," Sarah said. "The chain of command exists for good reasons. It ensures that people are held accountable for their actions, regardless of their rank or position." The implication was subtle but unmistakable, and Thompson's face flushed with anger. He took another step closer, now well within what most people would consider threatening distance. His size advantage was obvious. He outweighed Sarah by at least 80 pounds and towered over her by more than a foot. "You know what I think?" Thompson said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I think you're one of those troublemakers who doesn't understand how things work around here. Maybe you need someone to explain the rules to you." Sarah met his gaze steadily, showing no sign of intimidation. "I understand the rules perfectly, Sergeant. The question is whether you do." The standoff stretched for several long seconds, with neither person willing to back down. Finally, Thompson seemed to realize that his usual tactics weren't working. This wasn't some frightened private or vulnerable supply clerk. This was someone who refused to be intimidated by his size or his reputation. "This conversation isn't over either," Thompson said finally, echoing his earlier threat to Jenny. "I have a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot more of each other." As he walked away, Sarah remained in position until she was certain he was gone. Only then did she allow herself to relax slightly, though her mind was already working through the implications of what had just occurred. She had successfully protected Jenny, but, in doing so, she had revealed more about herself than she had intended. Thompson might be a bully, but he wasn't stupid. He would be watching her now, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. More importantly, she had essentially declared war on someone who clearly had no qualms about using his position and physical advantages to get what he wanted. Thompson would escalate this conflict, men like him always did when their authority was challenged. The only question was how far he would be willing to go, and whether Sarah would be able to maintain her cover while dealing with the threat he represented. As she made her way back to her quarters, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. She had been deployed on what was supposed to be a routine intelligence mission, but it was becoming clear that some of the most dangerous threats didn't come from enemy combatants. Sometimes the greatest danger came from within, from people who were supposed to be on the same side but had lost sight of what they were actually fighting for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Sarah had no doubt that Thompson would be watching for his opportunity to strike back. But she had faced worse odds before, and she had always found a way to complete her mission while protecting those who needed protection. This time would be no different, even if it meant risking everything she had worked so hard to build. The night air was cool against her face as she walked, and, somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopters returning from patrol. It was the sound of soldiers doing their jobs, following orders, and trying to make it home safely. It was exactly what everyone on this base should be focused on, instead of the petty power games and predatory behavior that seemed to follow men like Thompson wherever they went. Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to Jenny Morrison as she settled into her bunk that night. Whatever Thompson had planned, whatever escalation he might attempt, she would be ready for it. And, when the time came, he would learn that appearances could be very deceiving indeed. The next morning brought an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the base like a heavy blanket. Sarah had risen before dawn, as was her habit, using the quiet hours to maintain her physical conditioning with a carefully structured workout routine. Push-ups, pull-ups, and flexibility exercises that appeared routine to any observer but were actually designed to maintain the peak physical condition required for special operations. As she finished her morning routine and prepared for chow, Sarah noticed an unusual amount of activity around the motor pool. Raised voices carried across the compound, and she could see a small crowd gathering near one of the maintenance bays. Her instincts immediately went on alert. Crowds meant either trouble or entertainment, and, in her experience, the two were often indistinguishable. Making her way toward the commotion, Sarah could hear Thompson's distinctive voice rising above the others. He was clearly agitated about something, his tone carrying the particular edge that suggested someone was about to become the target of his displeasure. As she drew closer, the details of the situation became clearer. Private Collins, the same young soldier Thompson had humiliated in the mess hall the previous day, was standing in the center of a circle of mechanics and other personnel. His uniform was covered in grease and grime, and his hands were shaking as he held a damaged piece of equipment. Thompson stood over him like a predator toying with wounded prey. "Explain to me again how this happened," Thompson demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. "And, this time, try telling the truth instead of making up excuses." Collins stammered through an explanation about a hydraulic line failure that had occurred during routine maintenance. From what Sarah could gather, it was the kind of mechanical failure that could happen to anyone. Equipment wore out, seals failed, and sometimes accidents simply occurred despite everyone's best efforts. But Thompson wasn't interested in reasonable explanations. "So what you're telling me is that you destroyed military property because you were too incompetent to do your job properly. Do you have any idea what this piece of equipment costs? Do you understand that your carelessness might have put other soldiers at risk?" The accusation was unfair and everyone knew it, but none of the gathered soldiers seemed willing to speak up in Collins's defense. Sarah could see the frustration and fear in their faces, but also the resignation of people who had learned not to challenge Thompson's authority. It was a toxic dynamic that she recognized from other units where leadership had failed to address problematic behavior. Collins tried to explain again, pointing to obvious signs of mechanical wear that had caused the failure, but Thompson cut him off with a dismissive gesture. "I don't want to hear any more of your pathetic excuses. What I want is for you to take responsibility for your screw-up like a real soldier." Sarah watched as Thompson stepped closer to Collins, using his size to intimidate the smaller man. The pattern was exactly the same as the previous day's encounters: find a target who can't fight back, escalate the confrontation beyond what the situation warranted, and establish dominance through fear and humiliation. Maybe what you need is some additional training to teach you how to handle equipment properly, Thompson continued, his voice growing louder. Report to my office after evening chow. We're going to have a long discussion about military standards and what happens when soldiers fail to meet them. The threat was clear to everyone present. Thompson's additional training sessions were notorious among the lower-ranking soldiers, though the exact details were rarely discussed openly. Sarah had heard whispers about excessive physical punishment, verbal abuse, and psychological intimidation tactics that bordered on hazing. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah noticed that Collins remained behind, still holding the damaged equipment with obvious distress. His entire body language spoke of defeat and resignation, the look of someone who had given up hope of fair treatment. It was exactly the kind of behavior that bullies like Thompson fed on, the knowledge that their victims felt helpless and alone. Sarah approached Collins carefully, mindful that drawing attention to their interaction might make things worse for him later. "Private, are you all right?" Collins looked up with surprise, clearly not expecting kindness from a superior officer. "Yes, ma'am. Just dealing with some equipment issues." "I heard what happened," Sarah said gently. "That looked like normal wear and tear to me. Sometimes equipment fails no matter how careful you are." For a moment, Collins's composure cracked and she could see the desperation in his eyes. "It doesn't matter what really happened, ma'am. Sergeant Thompson has made up his mind, and arguing will just make things worse." The resignation in his voice was heartbreaking, and Sarah felt her anger toward Thompson solidify into something cold and focused. This wasn't just about one incident or one bully, it was about a pattern of abuse that was destroying morale and undermining the very foundations of military discipline and honor. "Has this kind of thing happened before?" Sarah asked carefully. Collins glanced around nervously before answering. "Sergeant Thompson has very high standards. Sometimes people don't meet them." It was the same type of deflection Jenny Morrison had used the previous day, minimizing the behavior, accepting responsibility for someone else's unreasonable actions, and desperately hoping the problem would resolve itself. Sarah recognized it as a classic response to ongoing harassment and abuse. Before she could respond, Thompson's voice boomed across the motor pool. "Collins! What are you doing standing around gossiping when you have work to finish? And you, Lieutenant, don't you have intelligence work to do instead of interfering with my soldiers?" Sarah turned to face Thompson with the same calm composure she had displayed the night before. "Actually, Sergeant, I was just admiring the quality of maintenance work your people do here. It's impressive how they handle such complex equipment under challenging conditions." The compliment was carefully calculated to put Thompson in a difficult position. He couldn't very well attack the quality of work his own unit performed without making himself look incompetent, but he also couldn't allow what he saw as a challenge to his authority to go unanswered. "My soldiers do excellent work when they follow proper procedures," Thompson replied, his eyes narrowing. "The problem comes when people get careless and think they don't have to follow the rules." "Of course," Sarah agreed. "Following proper procedures is essential. I'm sure you hold everyone to the same high standards, regardless of rank or position." Again, the implication was subtle but clear. Sarah was suggesting that standards should apply equally to everyone, including Thompson himself. It was the kind of verbal chess match that could appear perfectly innocent to casual observers while carrying deeper meaning for the primary participants. Thompson's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a commotion near the main gate drew everyone's attention. A convoy was returning from patrol, and, from the urgency of the radio chatter, it was clear that something had gone wrong. Medical personnel were already rushing toward the arriving vehicles, and Sarah's intelligence training kicked in automatically. "Excuse me," she said to Thompson, ending their confrontation as she moved toward the arriving convoy. Her cover story required her to be interested in operational intelligence, and a returning patrol might have valuable information about enemy activity in the area. The convoy had indeed encountered trouble. An improvised explosive device had damaged one of their vehicles, though fortunately there were no serious casualties. As Sarah listened to the debrief, she noticed Thompson lingering nearby, clearly frustrated that their confrontation had been interrupted. More concerning was the way Thompson's attention kept drifting toward her throughout the morning. She had successfully diffused 2 potential confrontations, but, in doing so, she had also painted a target on herself. Men like Thompson didn't simply forget about challenges to their authority, they brooded over them, planned responses, and waited for opportunities to reassert their dominance. The afternoon brought a new development that Sarah hadn't anticipated. She was reviewing intelligence reports in the communications center when Thompson appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the room. The other personnel became noticeably more tense, their conversations dropping to whispers. "Lieutenant Martinez," Thompson said, his tone deceptively casual. "I wonder if I could have a word with you. Privately." Sarah looked up from her reports with apparent unconcern, though every instinct was screaming that this was the escalation she had been expecting. "Of course, Sergeant. What can I do for you?" Thompson gestured toward the door. "Maybe we could step outside. What I have to say is somewhat sensitive." The phrasing was deliberately ambiguous, designed to make Sarah appear uncooperative if she refused. It was a classic manipulation tactic: create a situation where the target felt obligated to comply with an unreasonable request in order to avoid seeming difficult or unprofessional. Sarah gathered her papers with deliberate slowness, buying time to consider her options. She could refuse and cite operational security concerns, but that would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Thompson had clearly decided to move against her, and avoiding him indefinitely wasn't realistic in the confined environment of a forward operating base. "Of course," Sarah said finally, securing her documents and following Thompson outside. He led her away from the main buildings toward a more isolated area near the perimeter fence. It was a location that offered privacy for their conversation, but it was also far enough from regular foot traffic that no one would be likely to witness whatever Thompson had planned. As they walked, Sarah automatically cataloged potential weapons and escape routes. An old maintenance shed provided cover to the north, while a stack of supply pallets offered concealment to the east. The perimeter fence itself was topped with concertina wire, making it an unlikely retreat route but potentially useful for channeling movement during a confrontation. Thompson stopped near a cluster of concrete barriers that had been positioned to provide cover from potential sniper fire. The location was completely isolated from the main base activities, exactly the kind of place where someone might feel confident about acting without witnesses. "You know, Lieutenant," Thompson began, turning to face her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I've been thinking about our conversations yesterday. I think there might have been some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up." Sarah remained standing at a comfortable distance, her posture relaxed but her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. "What kind of misunderstandings, Sergeant?" Thompson's expression shifted slightly, his false friendliness giving way to something more predatory. "Well, for example, you seem to be under the impression that you can interfere with how I run my unit. That tells me that maybe nobody has explained to you how things work around here." The threat was becoming more explicit, exactly as Sarah had expected. Thompson had brought her to this isolated location for a reason, and that reason was becoming clearer with every word he spoke. "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah replied calmly. "I haven't interfered with anything. I've simply been doing my job and trying to be helpful when I see soldiers who might need assistance." Thompson laughed, but the sound was harsh and without humor. "Helpful? Is that what you call undermining my authority in front of my soldiers? Because where I come from, we have a different name for that kind of behavior." He stepped closer, deliberately invading her personal space in the same way he had done with Jenny Morrison and Private Collins. The intimidation tactic was so predictable that Sarah almost felt disappointed. She had expected something more creative from someone with Thompson's reputation. "I think maybe you've gotten the wrong impression about me," Thompson continued, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Maybe you think because you're an officer, or because you're a woman, that gives you some kind of special protection. Let me explain something to you, sweetheart, out here, the only thing that matters is who's stronger." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but internally she was making rapid calculations. Thompson was clearly building toward some kind of physical confrontation, probably assuming that his size advantage would make the outcome inevitable. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten bullies in trouble throughout history, the assumption that physical intimidation was always the ultimate arbiter of conflict. Sergeant, Sarah said quietly, I think you might want to reconsider whatever you're planning to do here. Thompson's smile widened, interpreting her words as a sign of fear rather than a warning. Oh, I've considered it very carefully. See, the thing about troublemakers is that sometimes they need to be taught a lesson. And the best lessons are the ones people remember for a long time. He took another step forward, now close enough that Sarah could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His hands were clenched at his sides, and she could see the anticipation in his eyes, the look of a predator who believed his prey was trapped and helpless. Here's what's going to happen, Thompson said, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something to a particularly slow child. You're going to apologize for disrespecting me in front of my soldiers. Then, you're going to promise that you'll mind your own business from now on and stay out of affairs that don't concern you. Sarah tilted her head slightly, as if considering his demands. And, if I don't? Thompson's grin became positively feral. Then, I'm going to have to help you understand the consequences of making poor choices. Don't worry, I'll be very thorough in my instruction. The sexual undertone in his threat was unmistakable, and Sarah felt the familiar cold anger that came with facing someone who preyed on the vulnerable. She had encountered men like Thompson in every corner of the world, bullies who used their position and physical advantages to terrorize those who couldn't defend themselves. But Thompson had made a critical error in his assessment of the situation. He had assumed that Sarah was just another potential victim, someone who would crumble under pressure and submit to his demands out of fear. It was exactly the kind of overconfidence that had destroyed more dangerous men than he could ever hope to become. You know, Sergeant, Sarah said conversationally, I think you might be operating under some misconceptions about who I am and what I'm capable of. Thompson laughed again, clearly enjoying what he saw as her pitiful attempt at defiance. Really? And what exactly do you think you're capable of, Lieutenant? Are you going to file a report? Complain to my commanding officer? Trust me, I've been through that dance before. By the time any investigation gets started, you'll be long gone from this base, and I'll still be here doing my job. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You're probably right about the bureaucratic options. Military investigations can take a long time, and there's always the problem of proving what actually happened when there are no witnesses around. Thompson's expression brightened, clearly interpreting her words as surrender. Exactly. See, I knew you were smarter than you looked. So why don't we skip all the unpleasant business and just get straight to the part where you apologize and we reach an understanding? Actually, Sarah said softly, I was thinking more about the immediate options for resolving our disagreement. Something in her tone must have registered as unusual, because Thompson's confident expression flickered for just a moment. But his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. After all, what could a small woman possibly do against someone of his size and experience? Immediate options? Thompson chuckled. Trust me, sweetheart, you